For every hit Broadway show you can name, there are just as many, if not more, flops to name as well. That is, Broadway shows that had short runs and usually do poorly at the box office. Sometimes, though, the memory of these flops outlive the hits of their day and evolve into Broadway legend. Somewhere in the world, someone is still talking about seeing Merrily We Roll Along on Broadway in 1981, how they were at the first preview of Carrie in 1988, where the entire audience booed the curtain call, or when they took a chance to see Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark and sat there thinking, wow, this is really happening. In this episode, I'm going to be discussing a show that is not a flop in the traditional sense. The show has never actually played a performance on Broadway, but the drama behind the scenes of Rebecca the Musical has become the stuff of legend. What started out as a determined mission to mount a big, lavish musical on the Great White Way soon dissolved into one of the most fascinating and bizarre scandals in Broadway history. I'm fairly sure that most people are not familiar with Rebecca, so I'm going to be taking the time to discuss the origins of the piece, a small glimpse into German musical theater, the role of a producer, and the risks of bringing a show to Broadway. So sit tight and hang in for the ride, everyone.
Last night, I dreamt I went to Mandalay again. It seemed to me I stood by the iron gate leading to the drive. And for a while, I could not enter, for the way was barred to me.
Rebecca began as a Gothic novel in 1938, written by English writer Daphne Du Maurier. The story follows a young, naive woman working as a companion for a wealthy New York socialite. During a visit to Monte Carlo, she meets a brooding and mysterious older Englishman named Maxim de Winter. Holy sh! After a brief and interesting courtship, they marry, eventually making their way to Max's esteemed family home, Mandalay, a sprawling Cornwall estate with an army of staff, including the cold and overbearing housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers. Mrs. Danvers does not hide her disapproval of the new Mrs. De Winter, her loyalties ever lying with her former mistress, the first Mrs. De Winter, Rebecca. Although the character of Rebecca is never seen, her presence casts a dark shadow over Mandalay. The elusive and strange circumstances of her death, and the cold affections of her new husband, lead the new Mrs. De Winter to realize that things are not what they seem. The novel was adapted into a Hollywood motion picture in 1940, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. The film starred Laurence Olivier and Joan Fontaine, and would go on to win the Academy Award for Best Picture. The story has since been adapted several times for television, radio, and even as an opera in 1983. It seemed only a matter of time before Daphne Du Maurier's dramatic novel was to be adapted for the musical stage, not on Broadway, but in Europe. Michael Kunze began his career working in Berlin as a lyric writer and producer for pop music in the 1970s, often collaborating with composer Sylvester Levay. Oh, and remember this song? Yeah, they wrote that. His professional foray into musical theater began when he was hired to adapt the lyrics for the German-language production of Evita in 1980, working closely with composer Andrew Lloyd Webber and director Harold Prince. His work on Evita led him to adapting several Broadway and West End shows for German audiences. Then in the early 1990s, he shifted to writing original material. With Sylvester Levay acting as composer, they wrote Elizabeth, a musical that chronicled the life and death of Empress Elizabeth of Austria. After the show's premiere in Vienna in 1992, Michael Kunze helped write a series of musicals in Germany and Austria, making him one of Europe's preeminent lyricists and librettists. After gaining permission from the Du Maurier family, he began work on the musical adaptation of Rebecca, once again enlisting Sylvester Levay to write the show's score. Rebecca, das Musical, opened in Vienna in September 2006. Staying faithful to the plot of the book, the musical featured grand pop ballads, lavish designs and special effects, including the burning and destruction of Mandalay. Enter Ben Sprecher, a theater owner and general manager that the New York Times once referred to as a driving force off-Broadway. He had helped produce a number of productions on and off-Broadway, including the 2005 revival of The Odd Couple, starring Nathan Lane and Matthew Broderick. But beyond this and a string of short-lived shows, he had yet to find notable success in his own right. In the fall of 2006, Sprecher received a phone call from his business associate and co-producer, Louise Forlenza. She had seen the opening night of Rebecca while on business in Vienna and told him he had to see the show. 3 weeks later, after flying in to take in a performance, Ben Sprecher became determined to make Rebecca his next big project. 2 years later, after a period of negotiations, United Stages Vienna granted Sprecher and Forlenza exclusive rights to produce the first English-language production of Rebecca. To better understand the role of a producer, I spoke with Michael Rubinoff. A former lawyer, he created the Canadian Music Theatre Project at Sheridan College in Oakville, Ontario. It was here where he conceived and nurtured the creation of the musical Come From Away that would go on to open on Broadway in 2017.
There's so many things that have to happen to get to Broadway. You need two things. You obviously need to raise capital in order to do it, money, and you need to continue to develop it along the way. On the development side, you can do that simply by holding private workshops, inviting, potential backers and partners to come see those private workshops. That's one part of the development. The other part of the development is really the out-of-town tryout, which we're seeing less and less of. But you do get an opportunity to put the show up, test out some of your marketing ideas, certainly gauge audience response, make some changes, and see what you really have. It's certainly the model that was engaged for Come From Away, which had, an extensive tryout going to 4 theaters and a hockey rink before it reached Broadway. And there are tons of benefits in doing that, because you do start to build a fan base, but you also start to build investors. In Rebecca's case, we don't see the big European German musicals, so to speak. When you've got something that just nobody knows what it is, you're really investing, in a sense, in the lead producer. The lead producer who, I believe, if you're a smart investor, you want to trust that that person has a good track record, has, a sense of taste that aligns with what you're excited about, has a good business acumen. It's just a huge risk, for sure.
By the spring of 2009, the producers had hired Christopher Hampton to work closely with Michael Kunze and adapt Rebecca in English. That aside, they committed to keeping the entire production team from Vienna, including the show's American director, Francesca Zambello. From the fall of 2009, a number of workshops and industry readings were held in London, featuring Sierra Boggess in the lead role. At this time, Boggess had recently made a splash in the Broadway staging of Disney's The Little Mermaid, and was preparing to make her West End debut in Andrew Lloyd Webber's Phantom of the Opera sequel, Love Never Dies. Details on where the show would premiere were disputed. At one point, many press releases said the show would have its premiere in Toronto, ahead of productions in London and New York. But by 2010, the producers seemed settled on London's West End, eyeing the Shaftesbury Theatre. Theatre real estate can be very competitive. A show's arrival may simply depend on what theaters are available at that time. Like, you probably wouldn't put Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard in a huge, massive theater unless, Beyoncé was in it. But Rebecca also came with specific physical demands, like the giant spiraling staircase that would collapse through an elevator in the stage floor. The prospects of the Shaftesbury Theatre changed, however, when preliminary excavations caused damage to the theatre's basement. At the prospects of an expensive renovation, Ben Sprecher would ultimately scrap plans for London. In November of 2011, it was announced that the producers had secured the Broadhurst Theatre on 44th Street, and that Rebecca would come to Broadway in the spring of 2012, foregoing the option to try the show out of town. Over the coming weeks, further details would be announced, like Sierra Boggess' official casting in the lead role, along with performers like Tam Mutu, James Barber, and Karen Mason, set to play the role of Mrs. Danvers. Graziella Daniele was announced as the show's new choreographer, but the biggest addition to Rebecca's creative team was Michael Blakemore, joining Francesca Zambello as co-director. In a later article by Michael Riedel of the New York Post, he reported that Blakemore was actually taking over the New York production, with Zambello being co-director in name only. Michael Riedel, of course, is known for his well-placed show business insiders, as well as his penchant for stirring drama in the New York theater scene. The specifics of why the co-director decision was made isn't really divulged, though I wonder if it may have had something to do with Francesca Zambello's recent work on Broadway. While she is an accomplished and respected director of opera, the negative critical reaction and underperformance of Disney's The Little Mermaid at the box office may have made the producers of Rebecca question her ability to helm a commercial Broadway musical. Even with all these shifts behind the scenes, Rebecca remained poised to start previews in March of 2012. The show's elaborate set was being built, and the cast tweeted their excitement leading up to the first day of rehearsal. But suddenly, everything grinded to a halt when on January 24th, 2012, Ben Sprecher and the producers announced that Rebecca had not reached its $12 million capital to put on the show. While it's not uncommon for a production to be raising money as late as possible, the show was still short about a third of its minimum capital, thus postponing it to the 2012-2013 Broadway season. The Broadway theater, like the rest of the world, had been dealt a major blow by the 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession that came in its wake. While technically the recession had ended by June 2009, many Broadway producers noted that once dependable investors were now harder to sign on. Only a few months before this, the much-anticipated Broadway revival of Funny Girl had been postponed indefinitely after investors had dropped out, in spite of it being fully cast, with sets and costumes under construction. Broadway has always been a gamble, with only 1 in 4 shows turning a profit. But in 2012, it seemed benefactors were now looking for more assurance of a return on their investments. While the producers looked to find the remaining $4.5 million to capitalize Rebecca, Louise Forlenza was referred to Mark Houghton, a stockbroker who had worked for Oppenheimer & Company, a prestigious boutique investment firm. Houghton would eventually connect her with Paul Abrams, a prosperous South African businessman, and following email correspondence with Ben Sprecher, Abrams committed to a $2 million investment and the other $2.5 million from affiliated parties of his. So in March, barely 2 months after announcing their postponement, Ben Sprecher announced that Rebecca would make its Broadway premiere in the fall. In a statement he wrote, "Rebecca is moving forward. We have identified the final missing piece of investment, and the Schuberts have graciously allowed us to resume production, to open at the Broadhurst in fall of 2012. The postponement would see the loss of Sierra Boggess and Tam Mutu to other opportunities, with actors Jill Pace and Ryan Silverman taking their place. Rebecca the Musical would now start previews on October 30th, ahead of a November 18th opening night. 1 month later, as Ben Sprecher and Louise Forlenza were securing their investments, they received an alarming series of emails from the executor of Paul Abrams, the investor that was to deliver the missing piece, reporting that he had fallen ill, been hospitalized, and had passed away. Sprecher and Forlenza kept mum of this uncertainty through the summer, even while cast members Jill Pace and Ryan Silverman were making publicity appearances to promote the show. But by September, as it became evident that the commitments of Abrams and his associates had not been secured, Ben Sprecher wrote in a press release, "Since the tragic and sudden death of a major investor in early August, we have been working with representatives of the estate to complete the committed investment. We had been reassured that the commitment would be honored and have tried day and night to finalize this matter, but as of yet, have been unable to do so, which has left us with no choice but to delay the start of rehearsals for Rebecca by 2 weeks. We are fiercely committed to resolving this issue as soon as possible." On September 22nd, it was revealed an angel investor had come forward to help fill the gap in the show's capital. The investor's only condition had been anonymity. The first day of rehearsal was now pushed to October 1st, but the cast would be paid leading up to this date. All settled, right? Well, sometime shortly after this announcement, the angel investor received emails from 2 separate informants. Alluding to articles from the New York Times and The Post, these emails warned him that the prospect of fraud, an ongoing money shortage, bad public perception, and anemic ticket sales daunted Rebecca, that the show's prospects were not very promising. The angel investor was alarmed at these revelations, also that their want for anonymity had been compromised, and shortly thereafter informed Sprecher and Forlenza that they were withdrawing their investment. On September 30th, just 1 day before the first day of rehearsal, the producers announced that Rebecca would not open that fall, and that the show had been postponed indefinitely. They cited the emails with malicious lies for scaring away the investor, and that they were working with the authorities to launch a criminal investigation. Ben Sprecher declined to share the name of the deceased investor with the press, but after some investigation, Patrick Healy of the New York Times managed to identify Paul Abrams' name. After a simple search on Google, he noticed that there didn't seem to be any obituary mentioning the death of a South African businessman named Paul Abrams, but more alarmingly, there didn't seem to be any record of a Paul Abrams at all. Before becoming acquainted with the producers of Rebecca, Mark Houghton had developed a long history of deceit. Records documented at least $19.4 million of orchestrated swindles on his behalf. As early as 1990, he was arrested for a scheme involving forgery of a bank guarantee. Along with his wife, Sherry Houghton, they allegedly stole the retirement savings of a neighbor, and Mark Houghton had apparently forged the signature of a friend so he could secure a loan to purchase a boat that he named Hot Catch. Yeah. After meeting with him in January 2012, the producers of Rebecca entered an agreement with Trinity Management Consulting Incorporated, a company that was controlled by Mark Houghton. Under the agreement, Houghton received a fee of $7,500 and a guarantee of 8% of any funds he raised in excess of $250,000, plus tiered percentages of Rebecca's net profits. Houghton provided the producers with purported email contact information for Paul Abrams, his affiliated parties, as well as the investment agreements they all signed. All of this fabricated by Mark Houghton, who would eventually collect approximately $60,000 from the producers. It would be the New York Times that ultimately named Mark Houghton, noting that he had been sued for fraud in federal courts in New York and Florida. Before the week was out, Sprecher would acknowledge that he had never actually met Paul Abrams and that he, along with the other associates, had never existed at all.
There is a legal qualification to invest. Only a certain person under law can invest. So it's not like anybody can invest in your show. When you decide to invest in a show, in your paperwork, you're signing that you're an accredited investor or a sophisticated investor. I believe in the American context, it's an accredited investor. I think mostly what is so key is that you want to know who these people are, especially if it's $4.5 million of a $12 million investment. You know, I wouldn't take emails, or I wouldn't take someone saying, oh yeah, I know some investors, you know, without meeting them, without knowing in the ordinary course that, you know, they've invested in theater before.
After his arrest, the producers of Rebecca sued Mark Houghton for $100 million. By the beginning of 2013, Ben Sprecher and Luis Forlenza would launch another lawsuit, this time for nearly $11 million, against Rebecca's own press agent, Mark Thibodeau. In the end, he was the one who had sent the emails to the angel investor, the very malicious emails referenced in a press release that he had composed himself, announcing the show's postponement. Thibodeau would later say, "My actions were those of a classic whistleblower, except that I wish I had the courage to come forward with what I had discovered and not hide behind anonymity." When news came of Paul Abrams' supposed death, Thibodeau had done a simple search on Google to find not only had Mark Houghton filed for bankruptcy with $15 million worth of debt, but that he had lost his stockbroker's license with multiple charges of fraud. I will always firmly believe that Mr. Sprecher and Miss Forlenza came to know that Paul Abrams was not real well before the show collapsed. I pointed them to actual evidence of that in fake investment papers that they had been in possession of for 8 months. Yet in their own written statement to the press and investors announcing the cancellation of the show, they continued to perpetuate the reality of Abrams. The fact is, they were still doing business with Houghton right up until the end. Mark Houghton pleaded guilty to 2 counts of fraud, one involving Rebecca, and another separate plot to defraud a Connecticut real estate company.
I mean, obviously, we're pleased that Mr. Houghton won't be able to do this to anybody else going forward. But Ben Sprecher's real focus now is getting Rebecca on Broadway. It's a great show, and he wants to do it.
While Ben Sprecher would continue to champion the show's future over the next few years, United Stages Vienna ultimately rescinded the rights for Rebecca in 2017, requiring he and Forlenza to pay $5.5 million back to their investors. For Rebecca, Mark Hutton would pay Sprecher and Forlenza $68,000. Keep in mind that they had sought $100 million. Hutton was sentenced to serve 3 years for his defrauding of the show. In 2015, however, various other illicit schemes would add a further 11 years to his sentence. The suit against Mark Thibodeau would make it to the New York Supreme Court, and while a jury did find him in breach of his contract, they did not find him liable for defamation charges. Of the $10 million the producers sought to gain in damages, they were awarded a mere $90,000. The Rebecca debacle put an end to Ben Sprecher's theater career in New York, tanking his reputation and, as one lawyer put it, making him radioactive. In 2018, he was reportedly making a career move into restaurant management. But in August of 2019, he found himself caught up in his own legal troubles. Troubles of which I don't feel like talking about in this forum. So, in case you haven't gathered from this hot mess of a Broadway venture, show business is really tough. Like, even just saying that just seems to barely scratch the surface. It's extremely competitive, almost always not lucrative, and of course, there are no guarantees. You are subject to any number of factors that are simply out of your control. We probably understand this more today than ever before.
I think what Rebecca has taught us that you need to keep your ambition in check. It doesn't matter how much you believe in a piece, you need to be pinned down and held down by the realities of the process. But I think we need to, when this happens, it shakes the integrity of the whole industry. And we've seen that in other places as well. It makes people more reluctant to invest, and it gives the good producers a harder time. So I think Rebecca did shake the confidence in the industry, but I think it was truly a situation where you had people that were just so far over their heads. And I think, producing is running a business, and you need business-minded people who understand the nature of investment and understand how to access capital if you're going to look at, putting something on a place like Broadway.
And of course, never has it been more challenging to be a Broadway producer than today. I am heartened to hear news that we could return to the theater as early as the fall of 2021, but it will be a slow and gradual process.
I think we're really going to see the value of that lead producers bring to the process. We already know, there's been shows that have announced they're closing or won't open, and there are so many factors to doing that. So now we're going to see which shows do return that have been running for a while, that truly the strength of those shows opening back up was based on the good, sound decision-making made by lead producers. It's going to be very telling when that happens, and it will happen.
In this whole mess, it's easy to forget the actual show that is the source of all of this. As of the publication of this video, Rebecca the Musical has yet to be brought to any English-speaking stage, and in spite of everything, there are still fans of the show that hope one day it will come to Broadway. After more than 80 years, Daphne Du Maurier's Rebecca is still a haunting and compelling piece of work, and continues to find relevance today. Taylor Swift recently wrote a song inspired by the work, and a new film adaptation was recently produced by Netflix. While the character of Rebecca De Winter is long gone, her ghost seems ever present, demanding to be remembered. And though Rebecca the Musical has yet to be seen on the Broadway stage, it still holds space in our minds, in our imaginations, also demanding to be remembered. To be thought of as a cautionary tale of lofty dreams, grand ambition, and the price we pay for letting them get the better of us.